Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily grind of a medieval peasant. And I do mean grind, because most of what they ate required one, and most of what they ate after grinding it was still somehow worse than what they started with. Then we move into the remarkable and repeatedly underestimated life of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun who had strong opinions about food, medicine, and frankly most things, and who managed to become one of the most influential thinkers in Europe from inside a small room attached to a church. After that, we step into the shoes, or more accurately the wooden-soled foot situation, of a medieval baker, a person whose entire existence was governed by a fire that never went out and a guild that was watching them very closely. And finally, we pull back the curtain on the official image of the medieval feast, that grand cinematic vision of roasted boar and towering pies, and discover what was actually being eaten, who was actually eating it, and why the gap between the two tells you almost everything you need to know about how medieval society actually worked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let us ease into tonight's journey together. You are awake before it is light outside, and this is not a lifestyle choice. It is simply what happens when you live in a single-room structure with thin walls, animals nearby, and a straw mattress that has long since stopped pretending to be comfortable. The cold finds you immediately, not dramatically, not like a storm, just quietly, insistently, in the way cold always operates in places that were not designed with your warmth as a priority. You pull whatever covering you have a little tighter, and you lie there for exactly as long as you are allowed, which is not long. There is work to be done, and the work begins with fire. If the fire went out overnight, and sometimes it does, this is the first crisis of the day. Not a crisis in the way the word gets used loosely, but a real, immediate problem, because without fire there is no warmth, no cooked food, and no negotiating with the day ahead. You coax whatever embers remain back into something useful, feeding them with dry grass, a handful of straw, anything that will catch. If you are lucky, it takes a few minutes. If you're not, it takes longer, and the morning is already slipping away from you. This is the world you live in. A small agricultural holding somewhere in medieval Europe, somewhere between the 10th and 15th centuries depending on exactly when we have dropped you into this experience. And the specifics of your daily life vary considerably depending on where you are, what the harvest was like last season, whether your lord is reasonable or not, and whether the weather has cooperated with the grain. The house you woke up in is likely a single main room, or perhaps two if your household has done well enough to build a small extension. The floor is packed earth. The roof is thatch. Light comes in through a single shuttered opening in the wall that serves as a window, and through the hole in the roof above the central hearth where the smoke is supposed to exit. It does not always exit cleanly. The interior of your house has a permanent smoky quality that has long since ceased to register on your senses the way a smell stops being a smell when you live inside it long enough. But the food is more consistent than almost anything else about this existence. And the food, as you're about to spend an entire day discovering, is a study in the gap between what sustains a body and what satisfies it. Breakfast, if it earns that title, arrives soon after the fire does. What you're eating is pottage, and this will be a word that becomes very familiar to you very quickly, because pottage is not a meal so much as a category, a broad and unenthusiastic category that encompasses almost anything that has been boiled in a pot until it stops being identifiable as its original ingredients. This morning's version is primarily oats, with water, with perhaps a small amount of something green pulled from the kitchen garden if the season allows it. Maybe a leek, maybe some wild herbs that grow near the edge of the field. The texture is thick and grey-brown and deeply non-committal. You eat it because it is there, and because the alternative is nothing, and nothing does not carry you through the morning's work. The bowl you eat from is wooden or earthenware, plain and serviceable, the product of a local craftsman rather than any merchant trade. The spoon is wooden. There is no fork. The fork, as a table implement widely used by ordinary people, is centuries away from being normal in this part of the world, and you do not notice its absence any more than you would notice the absence of something you have never had. You eat the pottage with the spoon, and you eat the bread with your hands, and these are not gaps in civilization. They are simply the implements available, used with practiced efficiency. The bread will come later in a fuller sense, though you may have a piece from yesterday's loaf right now. Bread is not something you make fresh every morning, because making bread requires grain to be milled, and milling is not something you do at home. You take your grain to the Lord's mill, where a miller grinds it for a fee, a portion of the flour itself taken as payment, which means that by the time the flour comes back to you, it is already less than it was. You bake when you have enough flour and enough fuel to make it worth doing, which is not every day. The loaf you are cutting into this morning is 2 or 3 days old already. It is not soft. It resists the knife with the quiet confidence of something that has decided this is its final form. The bread itself, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, is not the pale, pillowy thing that the word bread might conjure in a modern mind. It is dark, dense, and made from whatever grain was available, which for most medieval peasants meant rye or barley, or a mixture of grains called maslin, which combined wheat and rye together in proportions determined more by what was growing in the field than by any culinary preference. Wheat was the prestige grain. Wheat made white bread, fine crumbed and light, and white bread was not for you. White bread was for the people who owned the land you worked on, for the clergy, for the merchants with money enough to buy it. Your bread was different, and not just in colour. Rye bread had a sourness to it, from the long fermentation required to get it to rise at all, because rye contains less gluten than wheat and needs more encouragement. It was also denser, heavier, and capable of surviving for days without becoming completely inedible, which was a practical advantage in a world where bread was not made every morning. Some regions, particularly in Northern Europe, produced bread so dense and so enduring that it was cut into slabs called trenchers and used as a plate for other food, soaking up the juices of whatever sat on top of it and then eaten afterward, soggy and flavoured with everything that had rested on it during the meal. Whether this was an efficient use of resources or an act of quiet desperation is a matter of perspective. It was probably both, as most things in this world are both at the same time. You eat your bread, you go to work. The fields themselves deserve more than a passing mention, because the relationship between the medieval peasant and the land was not simply one of labouring on it. It was one of inhabiting a system, a highly organised and deeply regulated system called the open field system in many parts of England and Northern Europe, that shaped every aspect of agricultural life in ways that a modern viewer standing at the edge of a medieval village landscape would find striking. You did not own a compact farm. You owned, or more accurately held, strips of land scattered across the great open fields that surrounded the village, distributed in a pattern designed over generations to ensure that good and poor soil was mixed across the community rather than concentrated in a single holder's favour. Your strips of land were interleaved with those of your neighbours, separated by narrow ridges called balks, and you farmed them in a pattern that was coordinated across the whole community because the three-field rotation that sustained the agricultural system required it. The three-field rotation was the agricultural engine of medieval Northern Europe. One field grew winter grain, wheat or rye, planted in autumn and harvested the following summer. A second grew spring grain, oats or barley or peas and beans, planted in spring and harvested in late summer. A third lay fallow, unplanted, grazed by animals whose manure fertilised it, in preparation for the following year's planting. The fields rotated through this cycle annually, which meant that at any given time a third of the arable land was resting and being rebuilt. The system was not perfect. It was not as productive per acre as some later innovations would allow, but it was resilient, it was organised, and it had been refined over generations into something that worked tolerably well in the conditions it was designed for. What it required, and this is the part that shapes your daily experience as a peasant living inside it, was coordination. You could not plant your strips in the winter grain field while your neighbours were leaving theirs fallow. The animals that grazed the fallow and the harvested stubble were managed communally, grazing the village livestock together rather than fencing off individual plots. The timing of ploughing, planting and harvesting was set collectively, by the custom of the manor, by the decisions of the village meeting, by the accumulated practice of many generations. You were not an independent farmer making individual decisions. You were a component of a collective agricultural enterprise, and the collective nature of it, while it limited individual flexibility, also provided a form of shared risk management. When a particular strip did poorly, Your other strips in the field might do better. When the harvest was thin, the community faced it together rather than individually. The harvest, when it finally came in late summer and early autumn, was the culmination of the year's anxiety. Weather had been watched all summer, not from curiosity but from necessity. Too little rain produced stunted grain. Too much produced disease, the dark grey rot of mildew on wet grain, or the more terrifying ergot, the fungal growth that infected rye and other grains, and that produced, in those who ate bread made from infected flour, a condition that medieval people understood as a curse or a divine punishment, and that we now recognise as a neurological crisis caused by compounds in the fungus that affect the nervous system in profoundly disturbing ways. St. Anthony's Fire, it was called, from the burning sensation in the extremities that accompanied the convulsions and the hallucinations and the gangrene that followed severe exposure. The specific mechanism was not understood, but the connection between bad grain years and the sudden appearance of the fire in a community was observed well enough that there were practices around inspecting grain and rejecting obviously infected crops. Not always effective, but not entirely absent either. You think about the grain differently after you've carried a harvest like that. The dried peas soaking in the bowl by the fire, the flour in the sack near the wall, the salted pork hanging from the rafter. These are not just food, they are a hedge against a specific kind of failure. They are the winter that you are trying to get through, and the care with which you manage them, the rationing that begins almost immediately after the harvest is in, is not a character trait. It is what the situation requires of anyone paying attention. The question of what medieval peasants drank with their food deserves more than it usually gets. Ale was central, as mentioned, but the ale economy was itself a complex social institution. In smaller communities, households brewed their own ale and sold the surplus to neighbours, an activity called alewifery that was managed almost entirely by women, and that was the primary commercial enterprise available to women in many medieval communities. The regulation of ale, like the regulation of bread, was a civic concern. The assize of ale sat alongside the assize of bread as foundational medieval consumer protection legislation, setting standards for quality and price that were enforced through the role of the ale taster, a municipal official who was genuinely expected to taste the ale of local producers, assess its quality, and report violations to the appropriate authority. Milk was available seasonally from household livestock, and was used primarily in cooking and in the production of simple cheeses rather than as a drink in its own right, partly because fresh milk in an era without refrigeration had a short window before it became unreliable, and partly because the ale was more caloric and more reliable as a daily beverage. Water from springs and clean wells was drunk, and the medieval world had more discernment about water quality than is sometimes assumed, with communities aware of which sources were safe and which were not, even without the framework of germ theory to explain why. The idea that medieval people never drank water and relied entirely on alcohol is an exaggeration that misses the practical complexity of actual water and beverage management in communities that had been living on specific landscapes for generations and had accumulated specific knowledge about them. The work you're about to do is field work, because the overwhelming majority of medieval peasants were agricultural labourers, and their relationship to the land was total. Not total in a romantic sense, not in the way people sometimes speak of being rooted in the earth as a beautiful thing, but total in the sense that the land determined almost every material fact of your existence. What you could eat, how much of it, whether you would have enough to get through winter, whether you would owe so much of your harvest to the lord above you in the feudal structure that survival became a genuine calculation rather than an assumption. This is the thing that takes a while to really absorb when you're standing in a medieval field in the early morning with a piece of old rye bread in your hand. It is not just that the food was limited, it is that the limitation was structural. It was built into the system. The feudal arrangement meant that a significant portion of everything you grew was spoken for before you harvested it. The tithe to the church, 1/10 of your produce, was not a suggestion. It was a religious obligation enforced with the weight of both spiritual and temporal authority. The taxes and fees owed to the lord of the manor were equally non-negotiable. You paid in grain, in labour, in animals, in whatever the system decided you owed. You owed labour days on the lord's land, called corvée in the French tradition, boon work in the English, days when you were not farming your own holding but farming his, building his roads, maintaining his structures, contributing your body's energy to the upkeep of the estate that you technically served. What remained, after all of these obligations, was yours, and what remained was frequently not as much as it needed to be. You feel this in your body in ways that are hard to describe to someone who has always had enough. Not starvation necessarily, though starvation was a real possibility in bad years, and catastrophic years were not rare in medieval Europe. The great famines, the famine of the early 14th century that struck across much of northern Europe between 1315 and 1322, the recurring local failures caused by floods, droughts, crop diseases, the constant low-level pressure of a food system that operated on very thin margins, these were not distant historical abstractions, they were the texture of the world you lived in. But even in ordinary years, the condition was a kind of chronic insufficiency, a state of functioning on slightly less than your body would prefer day after day, month after month, season after season. You are not sick, you are not dying, you're simply running at a level of fuel that a person from a later century would find alarming, and you are doing it while performing physical labour that would exhaust a modern person within a few days. The morning passes in labour. The work of an agricultural peasant varied considerably by season, and the medieval agricultural year had its own rhythms and demands that shaped everything about daily life. Autumn meant harvest, the most intense period of labour, when the grain had to come in before the weather turned and the entire community worked extended hours, with an urgency that was not social pressure, but survival calculation. Winter was quieter in the field but busy indoors, with animals to tend, tools to repair, grain to thresh, the long slow work of processing what had been gathered. Spring meant ploughing and planting, another period of intense field work, the cultivation of the strips of the open field system in which many peasant communities worked their land communally in a pattern of divided strips that distributed good and bad soil more or less fairly among the households. Summer brought the weeding and tending and the anxious watching of weather, the slow build-up toward harvest again. By midday you're hungry again. Truly hungry, not restless hungry. Not the kind of appetite that wanders into a kitchen looking for something interesting. The kind that has earned it. The midday meal, if there is one, and on working days there usually is something, returns you to the world of pottage. The pot from this morning, or a variation on it. Perhaps with a bit more bulk now, a few dried peas or beans added to the base, because legumes are one of the most important crops in the medieval peasant's world, not because anyone has explained to you the concept of protein, but because peas and beans and lentils have been keeping people functional through lean winters long enough that their value is understood empirically even without the vocabulary to explain why. The peas you have are dried, stored from the harvest, hard and small and requiring significant time in hot water before they become anything resembling edible. You learn to soak them the night before. You learn to cook them for a very long time. You learn that undercooked dried peas are not a minor inconvenience but an active misery. And so patience becomes part of the recipe in a way that has nothing to do with culinary refinement and everything to do with the fact that your digestive system is already dealing with a significant amount of rough fibre and does not need additional challenges. The pottage today has peas, and it has a small amount of fat rendered from the salted pork that has been hanging in your home since autumn, and this fat is important in ways that go beyond flavour. Fat is calories. Fat is energy. Fat is the difference between a meal that gets you through the afternoon and one that does not. You eat it slowly, not out of appreciation, though the warmth of it is genuinely pleasant on a cold day, but because eating slowly makes it feel like more than it is. This is a skill that takes practice. You have had a lot of practice. The meat question is one of the most significant ones in understanding what medieval peasants actually ate, and the honest answer is that the answer depends enormously on context. The image of medieval people eating a great deal of meat is not entirely wrong, but it is wrong in the sense that it describes the experience of a fairly small portion of the population and leaves out the experience of everyone else. For the peasant in the field, meat was occasional, specific, and carefully managed. It was not a daily protein source. It was a seasonal event, a preservation exercise, and a marker of relative prosperity or its absence. The pig was the most important animal in the peasant's food world, and understanding why tells you a great deal about how medieval food strategy worked. A pig could be raised on scraps, on waste, on whatever was left over from the kitchen and the field. It required almost no grain, which was precious, and could forage for itself in the woods under the practice called pannage. the autumn rite to let pigs root among the fallen acorns and beech mast in the Lord's forest. By late autumn, a pig that had spent months eating freely was ready to slaughter, and the slaughter of the household pig was one of the significant events of the year, not just in terms of nutrition, but in terms of the work it generated and the weeks of preservation that followed. Everything was used, the fat rendered down and stored for cooking, the blood mixed with grain and spices and stuffed into intestine casings to make what we would call black pudding, which sounds alarming to a modern ear, but was simply the intelligent use of a resource that would otherwise be wasted. The organs eaten fresh in the days immediately after the slaughter, because they would not keep in the cold but in perfect preservation conditions of the house, and so a slaughter day had an element of brief feast to it, a moment of genuine plenty before the long work of preservation began. The trotters, the ears, the head, nothing was set aside as unworthy of the pot. The rest of the meat was salted, heavily and stored, and this salted pork became the backbone of winter eating, small amounts of it flavouring the pottage, contributing its fat and its salt to the grey daily porridge, making the unvarying base slightly more bearable. But the pig was not always available. There were years when a pig could not be maintained. There were households where the margin was too thin for the luxury of an animal that needed feeding even if it needed relatively little. There were communities where the woodland rights had been restricted or removed, where pannage was no longer available, where the slow encroachment of lordly authority over common resources had narrowed the options. In those situations, you ate what was available in a different way, leaning harder on the grains, on the legumes, on whatever could be foraged or gathered from the edges of the cultivated world, from the hedgerows and the commons and the seasonal abundance that the landscape offered to anyone patient enough to pay attention to it. Wild plants were not a romanticised supplement to the medieval peasant diet. They were a systematic and essential part of it. The hedgerows and field edges produced nettles in spring, dandelion leaves, wild garlic, sorrel, various edible roots that those who knew what they were looking for could identify and use. Mushrooms were gathered in autumn, a practice that required knowledge specific enough to pass down carefully, because the penalties for errors in mushroom identification were swift and not survivable. Wild berries supplemented what the kitchen garden produced. The commons, the shared land that peasant communities depended on before the enclosure movement slowly took it away over later centuries, provided grazing, wood, and the foraging ground that made the difference between winter survival and winter difficulty. The commons were not merely a convenience, they were part of the food system, and when they were taken away, the food security of the community that had relied on them did not quietly absorb the loss. The kitchen garden, a small plot near the home, was the most direct food production in a peasant's life, and it was usually managed primarily by women. Here grew the leeks, the onions, the cabbages, the parsnips, the turnips, the herbs, parsley, sage, and various medicinal and culinary plants that occupied the borderline between food and medicine that was, in the medieval mind, not a very clear borderline at all. These were not decoration, and they were not flavour enhancement in the modern sense. They were calories, vitamins, and variety. The things that kept the body from breaking down entirely during the long months when the diet narrowed and the cold kept the land from producing anything new. A well-maintained kitchen garden was not a nice addition to a peasant household. It was a survival mechanism. The woman who tended it was performing a form of agricultural management that did not get called that, but that was no less skilled or less essential for the lack of a title. The afternoon finds you still working, and the hunger is still present, a background condition rather than an emergency. You have learned to operate at this level. Your body has adapted to it, not because it is healthy exactly, but because adaptation is what bodies do, and this body has never known anything different. The skeletal record of medieval peasants, and archaeologists have examined enough of it to say some things with reasonable confidence, shows the evidence of this chronic condition written in bone. Growth interruptions called Harris lines, visible in radiographic examination, indicate periods during childhood when growth slowed or stopped in response to nutritional or disease stress, then resumed when conditions improved. Dental evidence reflects the high carbohydrate, low variety diet. Skeletal evidence of hard physical labour is pervasive, the wear on joints, the muscle attachment points enlarged by years of heavy work, the compression fractures and injuries that accumulated in bodies pushed continuously beyond what they were comfortably capable of sustaining. This is not the romantic simplicity of a pre-industrial idyll. This is the physical record of people who worked extremely hard on not quite enough, and who did so not as a chosen lifestyle, but as a structural condition imposed by the economic and political system they were born into and had very limited means of exiting. The flavour question is worth sitting with, because it tends to get compressed into a simple statement that medieval peasant food was bland, and the truth is more specific and more interesting than that. The food was not necessarily flavourless. It was limited, which is different. The onions and leeks and garlic that went into the pottage were genuinely flavourful. The herbs from the kitchen garden contributed real aromatics to otherwise simple preparations. Salt, where it could be afforded or obtained, was used. Mustard. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Mustard grew wild and was cultivated enough to appear in peasant cooking. The problem was not the absence of flavour so much as the absence of variety. The repetition of the same combination of flavours day after day and week after week, until the palate stopped registering them as interesting and started registering them simply as food, as background. Compare this to the spiced, elaborately sourced food of the wealthy households, where pepper and cinnamon and ginger and cloves transformed the same basic ingredients into something that signalled not just culinary sophistication, but the vast economic reach required to purchase spices that had travelled from Southeast Asia and India through multiple trade networks before arriving at this table. The contrast between the spiced food of the upper classes and the unspiced food of the lower classes was not incidental. It was one of the most legible markers of social position in the medieval food landscape, and everyone who ate understood it, even if they had never thought it through in those terms. You sit by the fire at the end of this day and you feel primarily tired. The tiredness is total, the kind that lives in the muscles and the back and the hands, the kind that does not require any philosophical reflection, because it is not interested in being interpreted. It simply is. And as you sit there with your bowl and your bread and your thin ale, something settles around you that is less comfortable than peace, and more honest than contentment. This is the day as it was, the day that repeated itself, with seasonal variations across years and decades. The day that hundreds of millions of people in medieval Europe lived in one form or another, the specific details shifting by region, by decade, by the particular arrangements of the feudal hierarchy they found themselves within, but the basic structure holding. The ale should be mentioned because it was significant and because it is often misunderstood. Not as an indulgence, but as a practical reality. Water from open sources was genuinely unreliable in terms of safety, not because medieval people understood germ theory, but because they understood empirically that certain water sources made people ill and others did not, and that ale, produced through a process that included boiling water in the malting and mashing stages of brewing, was reliably safer than raw water drawn from a well or stream that might be contaminated by runoff from livestock or human settlement. Ale was made at home, by women primarily, as a regular household task. It was called ale wife as a professional term for women who brewed commercially, and the production of ale was one of the few commercial activities open to women in medieval towns and villages. The ale that peasants drank daily was low in alcohol, not the strong clarified product of later centuries, but something thin and cloudy and slightly sour, nothing resembling the amber clarity of a modern pint, but it provided modest calories, modest hydration, and modest reassurance. The supper, the evening meal, brings you back to the fire and back to the pot. The rhythm of it is relentless, not because the food is bad exactly, though it is monotonous in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine from a position of having access to almost unlimited variety, but because the rhythm never changes. Pottage, bread, whatever was preserved. The occasional egg from the chickens kept in the yard, small and seasonal, valued enough that selling eggs at market was a real source of small income for households that kept poultry. A fresh egg in spring felt like a genuine luxury, not because eggs were exotic, but because eggs were seasonal in a world without artificial lighting for hen houses, and winter's scarcity made spring's return of production noticeable and welcome. Soft cheese sometimes, made from the milk of the household goat or cow if you had one, fresh and simple and not aged, because aging cheese required more time and resource than most households had available. The cheese was not the complex matured varieties that we associate with artisan production now. It was something made quickly from curdled milk, drained, perhaps lightly salted, eaten fresh within days of making. It was nourishment, and it was variety, and variety in this diet was not a preference, it was a relief. The winter months deserve particular attention, because they were the hardest part of the medieval year, and the time when the structural fragility of the peasant food supply was most exposed. By January and February, what had been preserved in autumn was running lower. The kitchen garden produced nothing, the fields were bare, the animals, kept alive through the winter on stored fodder, had reduced their milk production and could not be slaughtered because their breeding capacity was needed for the following year. The diet in late winter narrowed to its most basic form, the pottage thinner, the bread made from whatever remained, the salted pork stretched further, the dried peas and beans doing the heavy lifting of nutrition in a way that they had been doing for months already. This is the period that agricultural historians have identified as the hungry gap, the time between when stored supplies from the previous harvest ran lowest and when the new season's growth began to be available. It was not universal and it was not every year, but it was a recognised risk, and the management of it, the careful rationing and preservation and planning that tried to prevent the worst of it, occupied a significant part of the intellectual energy of any peasant household managing its own survival. Getting it wrong, or having a bad harvest to make the calculation impossible from the beginning, meant genuine hunger. In catastrophic years, it meant famine. The memory of famine years lasted for generations. When the Great Famine struck northern Europe in the second decade of the 14th century, the death toll was substantial. Contemporary accounts describe desperate people eating things that were not food, the bark of trees, grass, the bodies of those who had already died. These were not isolated individual stories. They were descriptions of communities in collapse, the thin margin of the peasant food supply having been eliminated entirely by a combination of failed harvests, cold summers, and the economic pressures that prevented recovery. The feudal system continued to extract its dues, even as the people paying them starved. The church's tithes continued. The obligations did not dissolve because the crops had failed. You think about this as you lie back down on your straw mattress, and the cold comes back and the fire is low and the morning is somewhere ahead of you. Not with bitterness necessarily, because bitterness requires a comparison to something better, and for most people in this world the comparison was not available in any practical sense. You did not spend much time imagining a different life, because imagining a different life was not something the day offered time for. What you thought about, probably, was the practical inventory of what came next, what needed doing, what was running low, whether the weather looked like it would hold for long enough to get the spring ploughing started, whether the sheep had been checked, whether the child who had been coughing for 3 days was getting better or not. The food you ate was the food the world gave you, in the amounts the system allowed, prepared with the knowledge you had inherited and the fuel and tools you could maintain. It was grey and repetitive and sometimes genuinely not enough, and the bodies it fed carry the record of that in the archaeology of their bones, and the people who ate it were not waiting to be rescued from it, or mourning an abundance they had never had. They were managing intelligently and practically within the constraints that the world imposed on them, which is what people do, in every era, in every set of circumstances that the world decides is the one they will inhabit. The seasons deserve their own examination when it comes to understanding what a medieval peasant actually ate through the course of a year, because the calendar of food was nothing like the year-round availability that modern life takes entirely for granted. Spring was a time of scarcity that was also a time of gradual return. The kitchen garden began to produce. Young nettles could be gathered and cooked, providing something green and nutritious after months of dried, preserved, and stored food. Early eggs returned as the hens responded to the lengthening days. The first of the season's dairy, the milk that came back as grass grew and animals were moved to pasture, was a genuine arrival. None of these things were abundant at first. They were beginning, slowly, to be available, which was a different and more hopeful thing than the closed-off world of January and February, when what you had was what you had stored, and the New Year's production was still weeks or months away. Summer brought abundance relative to the winter, but it was abundance of a specific and labour-intensive kind. The kitchen garden was producing greens, peas in their pods while they were young and tender, beans, the various herbs that would be dried for winter use while they were at their peak, soft fruit where it could be found, wild berries from the hedgerows. The dairy production was at its maximum, which meant more fresh milk, more cheese, more butter where cows were kept. but summer also meant the heaviest field labour of the year, and the calories burned in midsummer work were substantial. The food of summer was more varied than the food of winter, but the demand on it was also greater, and the two tended to balance in a way that left the body functioning at about the same level of adequacy throughout the year, which is to say, adequately and no more. Autumn was the pivot. The harvest, when it was good, produced a period of real if brief abundance. The grain was in. The peas and beans were dried and stored. The pig was fattened from the summer's foraging. The fruit that could be dried or preserved was processed and stored. Mushrooms were gathered from the fields and forests in quantities that would sustain through winter. The apple harvest in regions where apple trees were cultivated produced cider in addition to fresh fruit, another fermented beverage that joined ale in the household's liquid stores. For a few weeks after a good harvest, the medieval peasant household ate and drank, with a variety and a relative abundance that the rest of the year did not provide, and this was understood and appreciated as the reward for the year's labour, the moment when the margin between enough and not enough was at its widest. Then the cold came and the narrowing began again. The fishing that supplemented the agricultural diet is worth exploring in more detail, because fish were accessible to a wider range of medieval people than the great sea fisheries might suggest. Rivers and streams ran through most of the medieval English and European countryside, and the fish in them were a supplementary food source that required relatively little infrastructure to access. Freshwater fishing with simple lines and nets was practiced widely, though the rights to fish specific stretches of river were often controlled by the lord of the manor, and the illegal taking of fish from waters you had no rights in was poaching, in the same way that taking the lord's deer was poaching, a serious offence enforced with real penalties. But where fishing rights were available, the rivers and ponds of the medieval landscape provided a meaningful addition to the diet, particularly on fast days when fish was specifically required and when the alternative was to eat nothing except bread and vegetables. The salting and preservation of fish at the household level was another skill that contributed to winter food stores. Small fish caught in quantity during productive seasons could be salted and kept. Eels, which were plentiful in many medieval English rivers and which were collected in the basket traps called eel weirs that studded the waterways, were a significant food source that appears frequently in medieval records as rents paid in kind, as gifts, as part of the economic exchange of the agricultural community. The Domesday Book, the Great Survey of England conducted in 1086, records eel weirs across the country and their annual yields in the thousands, suggesting a food economy in which eels were genuinely important, not as an exotic specialty, but as a common and reliable source of protein available to a wide range of people. The role of cheese in the medieval peasant diet is often underestimated. The simple fresh cheeses that peasant households produced when dairy animals were in milk were not the sophisticated aged varieties of the commercial cheesemakers, but they were calorie-dense, they were nourishing, and they were produced from the milk that otherwise had a very limited shelf life and needed to be used or preserved immediately. The pressing and salting of a simple cheese extended the usefulness of a lactating animal well beyond the immediate window of the fresh milk, and the resulting product could be stored for weeks or months, depending on how heavily it was pressed and salted. Hard cheeses, more thoroughly drained and heavily salted, lasted longer and travelled better, which is why cheese became a commercial product carried along trade routes and appearing in market records. But the domestic fresh cheese of the peasant household was a different thing, made quickly from the day's milk, eaten within days, part of the domestic food cycle rather than the commercial one. The mental landscape of the medieval peasant's relationship to food is almost as interesting as the physical one. The religious calendar shaped not just the type of food consumed, but the meaning attributed to the consumption. Feast days were genuinely feasts, days on which the usual restrictions of ordinary diet were relaxed, and the community ate in a way that marked the day as different. The feast day meal of a peasant community was not the elaborate multi-course production of a great noble house, but it was something different from the daily pottage, something that acknowledged the occasion through modest abundance. The collective nature of feast day celebration, the sharing of food with neighbours, the communal elements of many religious holidays, created a rhythm to the year in which food was not only sustenance, but also the medium through which time was marked and community was expressed. The Lord's Hall was the site of seasonal hospitality that the feudal structure required, and peasants in good years might expect some form of provision from the Lord at major feast days, a remnant of the older obligation of hospitality that the great held to their dependents. By the high medieval period, this was more token than substantial in most places, but the expectation of it, and the occasional reality of it, formed part of the peasants' understanding of their relationship to the hierarchy above them. You laboured for the Lord. The Lord in turn had obligations, including the obligation to ensure that the community did not starve entirely in bad years, an obligation enforced less by law than by the social consequences of failing to meet it, the resentment and occasionally the active resistance of a community pushed too far. The understanding of hunger as both a physical state and a social position runs through the entire medieval world in ways that the food history alone does not fully capture. When you are hungry in a structural sense, when your hunger is not the result of individual circumstances but of where you stand in a system that has decided this is your allocation, the experience has a different quality than simple physical need. It is the hunger of knowing that somewhere relatively nearby, or perhaps not nearby but certainly real, other people are eating what you cannot access. Medieval people were not abstract thinkers about social inequality in the modern sense, but they were not unaware of the arrangement they lived in. The poem Piers Plowman, the sermon literature that survives from the medieval English church, the complaint poetry that surfaces in various times of particular stress, these texts are full of awareness that the arrangement of food and plenty was not natural, not inevitable, not the only possible way for the world to be organised. The awareness did not produce revolution in most times and most places, but it was there, articulated in the margin of a manuscript, muttered at the roadside, expressed in the particular bitterness of a bad harvest year, when the Lord's barns were full and the village was not. The revolt of 1381 in England, the great uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt, had many causes, but the food economy was wound through all of them. The poll taxes that provoked the immediate crisis were taxes on people who had already paid in labour, in grain, in animals, who had already given up substantial portions of their lives to the maintenance of a system that did not return proportional benefits to them. The demands of the rebels included the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents, the end of the labour obligations that tied people to the land and to the lord. They included, in other words, the reform of exactly the system that determined what medieval peasants ate and how much of what they produced they could keep. The revolt was suppressed. The reforms did not materialise in the form the rebels demanded, but the feudal system had been made visibly fragile in a way that the following century's labour shortages, produced by the population losses of the Black Death, continued to advance. The long decline of serfdom in England after the 14th century was not the result of a single cause, but the food economy's role in it, the changed relationship between labour supply and labour demand that made the old extraction rates unsustainable, was fundamental. The flavour of bread. It is worth returning to as something specific and sensory that connects the history to the body in a way that the economic and political analysis alone does not. Rye bread made with a sourdough starter, left to ferment for a long time before baking, produced a flavour that was genuinely complex, sour and deep and slightly yeasty, and that when it was fresh from the oven, still warm, with whatever small amount of fat the household could put on it, was genuinely good to eat. Not good in the way that modern abundance makes almost anything possible, but good in the way that a thing is good when it has been made with skill and care from ingredients that required labour to produce, and when you are truly hungry, and this is what there is. The medieval peasant eating fresh bread on a day when bread had just been made was not experiencing poverty so much as simplicity. The specific simplicity of a food made from a few things that had been worked over carefully and that delivered everything those few things were capable of delivering. It is the accumulated monotony that was the real burden, not any single meal but the repetition of similar meals across months and years. The palate adapts, the appetite accommodates. But something in the imagination does not fully adapt, and the fantasy of variety, of different tastes and different textures, was as real in the medieval mind as the physical hunger, expressed in the medieval legend of the land of Cockaigne, the imaginary country where food fell from the trees, where roasted pigs walked around already equipped with knives for carving, where all the wants of the belly were met without labour, without rationing, without the endless management of scarcity. The fantasy was not sophisticated, but it was honest. It told you exactly what the reality was, by showing you what the reality was not. Take a moment with that. because what comes next is a different kind of story, but it belongs to the same world, and it begins in a very small room. The monastery and the parish church represented the two most visible institutions of the medieval world, and both of them were deeply involved in the food economy in ways that went beyond the obvious fact of the tithe. The monastery was itself a significant agricultural enterprise in many regions, managing estates, mills, fish ponds, vineyards, and the full range of agricultural production with the same administrative seriousness that it brought to the management of its spiritual life. Monastic agriculture was in some periods more productive and better managed than the surrounding secular estates, because the monastic community had access to literacy, record-keeping, and long-term institutional memory in ways that the individual lord or peasant farming family did not. The monastic granary and the monastic cellar were well stocked, not simply because monks ate well, though some certainly did, but because the monastery had obligations of hospitality to travellers and pilgrims, obligations to feed the poor at the gate, and obligations to maintain its own community and health and productivity across an institutional lifetime that extended far beyond any individual member. The Rule of St. Benedict, the fundamental document governing the Benedictine monastic tradition in which Hildegard lived and worked, had specific provisions about food that are worth noting because they represent a detailed and thoughtful medieval position on what a regulated community required to sustain itself in health and good order. Benedict specified that 2 cooked dishes should be served at the main meal each day, with a third of raw vegetables if available, and that a sufficient quantity of bread should be provided. He was realistic about the varying needs of different members, noting that those doing heavy work required more than those doing lighter tasks, and he was flexible about the addition of meat for the sick and for those who were weak, while restricting meat from the healthier members of the community more broadly. He wrote about the dangers of overeating and undereating with equal concern, understanding both as threats to the contemplative life he was trying to organise. The Benedictine approach to food was in some ways more sophisticated than the approach available to the peasant community outside the monastery walls, not because monks were morally superior eaters, but because they had an institutional framework, a tradition of medical knowledge, and sufficient resources to manage their diet with more deliberation than the peasant who was eating what the land and the system allowed. Hildegard's writing about food and health belongs to this tradition of deliberate monastic attention to the relationship between the body and what it ate, and it is not coincidental that the most sophisticated medieval writing about diet and nutrition came from religious communities rather than from the agricultural households that fed most of medieval Europe. The market as a food institution deserves a final mention, because the medieval market was the mechanism through which the agricultural surplus of the countryside was converted into money, and through which that money was converted into the range of goods that any individual household could not produce entirely for itself. The weekly market in a medieval town was the economic hub of its region, drawing farmers, traders, craftspeople, and buyers from the surrounding countryside and from the town itself, and the range of food on offer there varied enormously by region, by season, and by the prosperity of the particular community. A well-attended market in a prosperous town near good agricultural land in a good harvest year offered a range that a traveller from a different season or a different region might find remarkable. A thin market in a bad year offered little beyond the basics and did not do so cheaply. The market also offered ready-cooked food in the form of the street vendors and cook shops that were a feature of medieval urban life. The person who lived in a rented room with no cooking facilities, the traveller passing through, the labourer who had worked through the market hours and wanted to eat quickly, all of them could buy prepared food from the cooks who set up in the market squares and the alley kitchens of medieval towns. Pies, roasted meats, soups sold by the bowl, bread of various kinds. These were the medieval equivalent of street food, and the cook shops that served them were regulated by the same municipal authorities that regulated the bakers and the butchers, because contaminated or fraudulently short-measured street food was as much a public health and civic concern as any other aspect of the food supply. The story of Hildegard of Bingen begins, as so many truly interesting stories do, in a situation that was not of her choosing. She was born in the year 1098, the 10th child of a noble family in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany, and the 10th child of a noble family in the 12th century had a fairly circumscribed set of futures available to her. The church was one of them. It was, in the parlance of the time, tithe to God, a practice of some families, giving their 10th child to religious life in the same way that a 10th of the harvest went to the church. This tithe of a child sounds extraordinary from the outside, and it was not a universal practice, but it was recognised and documented enough to have a name, and Hildegard was 8 years old when she was placed in the care of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, an anchoress who lived in a small enclosure attached to the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg. An anchoress was, in the most literal sense, someone who had been enclosed. The enclosure was formal and permanent, a religious ceremony that in some traditions resembled a funeral. The door sealed, the world left behind. Jutta had chosen this life as the ultimate expression of religious devotion, a withdrawal from the world so complete that it took physical form in sealed walls. Into this, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Into this enclosure came the small girl entrusted to her care, and in this impossible-seeming space, improbably, one of the most remarkable minds of the medieval period began to develop. Hildegard learned to read Latin, the language of learning and of the church, the key that unlocked the enormous repository of accumulated knowledge that existed in the monastic libraries of her world. She learned music, which in the Benedictine tradition was not a supplementary study but a central one, the daily liturgy being sung rather than spoken, the Benedictine offices structured around musical performance in a way that made musical literacy as foundational as any other form of study. She learned the rhythms of religious life and the deep interior world of contemplation that monastic practice was designed to cultivate, and she began very early to have visions. Not vague spiritual experiences, but something she described with remarkable precision and consistency over an entire lifetime as a living light, a luminosity that she perceived not with the eyes of the body, but with some interior faculty that she struggled to describe in the vocabulary available to her and eventually simply named and accepted. She called it the reflection of the living light, and she maintained throughout her life that these visions came to her in a state of full waking consciousness, not in dreams, not in trance, not in states of illness or extremity. She saw this light as a child. She saw it as an old woman. Whatever the experience was, it did not leave her. What she chose to do with it is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. For most of her early life, Hildegard kept her visions largely private. She was aware, with a political intelligence that would prove to be one of her most consistent characteristics, that a woman claiming direct mystical experience in the 12th century church was navigating very dangerous territory. The church had structures, hierarchies, approved channels through which divine communication was supposed to flow, and a woman operating outside those channels claiming her own direct access to divine knowledge was not simply unusual, she was a potential problem. Mystical claims from women could be celebrated, or they could be condemned as evidence of demonic interference or simple delusion, and the difference between those two outcomes often had less to do with the content of the visions, and more to do with whether the right people endorsed them, and whether the woman in question had managed her position within the institutional church carefully enough to have credibility when she needed it. Hildegard spent decades building the kind of credibility that would allow her to be heard rather than dismissed. She became the head of her community after Jutta died in 1136. She managed the practical administration of a growing group of women. She was recognized within the network of Benedictine monasteries as a figure of reliability and good judgment. When she finally decided in her early 40s to begin committing her visions to writing, she did not simply start writing. She sought and obtained the approval of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures in Europe at the time, a man whose endorsement carried genuine institutional weight, and she obtained the approval of Pope Eugenius III himself, who heard selections from her work at the Synod of Trier around 1147 and gave it his support. The endorsements were not incidental. They were strategic. They were the armour that would allow her work to survive in an institutional environment that had every mechanism available to dismiss or suppress the writings of a woman who had not obtained proper authorization. Hildegard was not naive about this. She understood exactly what she was doing when she secured those endorsements before releasing her work more broadly, and the understanding speaks to an intellectual sophistication that went well beyond the theological content of the visions themselves. The first major work, called Civias, from the Latin meaning something close to know the ways of God, was a theological vision text that occupied her for 10 years and established her beyond question as a visionary of genuine importance in the religious culture of her time. It was illustrated, apparently under her direction, with remarkable images that gave visual form to the vision she described in her text. The combination of theological depth, visionary authority, and institutional endorsement made it impossible to ignore, and it was not ignored. Copies spread. Correspondence arrived. Her reputation, which she had been carefully building for decades, began to move well beyond the immediate region of her monastery. But Hildegard was not only a theologian, and it is the breadth of her intellectual interest that makes her genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply unusual. She wrote music, 77 surviving liturgical compositions that represent the largest surviving body of music attributed to a single composer from the medieval period. Her music was not conventional. It had a distinctive quality, wide melodic ranges, unusual intervallic leaps, an expressiveness that departed from the more regulated style of Gregorian plainchant in ways that contemporary musicians found remarkable. Some of her sequences and antiphons have been recorded and performed frequently in the modern period, and they hold their own as compositions, not just as historical curiosities. She wrote poetry, the texts for her musical compositions, and also a collection of visionary texts called the Ordo Virtutum, sometimes described as the earliest surviving morality play, a dramatic work in which the soul battles with the devil and is aided by the personified virtues. She invented a constructed language with its own alphabet called lingua ignota, whose purpose is not entirely clear but which included around 900 words, mostly for people and plants and animals, and whose existence suggests a mind that found the exploration of language itself interesting enough to invent a new one. And then there were the scientific and medical works, the two texts known as Physica and Causae et Curae, which represent her systematic engagement with the natural world and the human body, and which bring her directly into conversation with the food world we have been exploring. Hildegard wrote about food the way she wrote about everything, systematically, specifically, with a clear sense that the relationship between what you ate and the state of your body and even your temperament was a subject that deserved careful attention. Her framework drew on the ancient theory of the four humours, the idea inherited from classical Greek medicine through Arab scholarship that the body was governed by the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and that illness arose from imbalance between them. This was not unusual for a 12th century thinker. The humoral theory was the dominant framework for understanding health and illness in her world, and she was working within it rather than against it. What was unusual was the depth and specificity with which she applied it, and the particular way she connected food to what we might loosely call temperament and psychological state, not just to physical health. Her observations about spelt are representative of her approach. Spelt, the ancient grain that is a relative of wheat and that had been cultivated in the Rhineland since prehistoric times, was for Hildegard not just a nutritious food source, but something she described as having a special warmth and goodness, a quality that made it nourishing in an unusually complete way. She recommended it for the sick, for the weak, for those whose constitution needed strengthening. She compared it favourably to other grains in terms of its effect on the body, placing it at a kind of pinnacle of the grain hierarchy, based on its humoral properties and its practical effects on the people who ate it. Whether or not this analysis maps onto modern nutritional science is not entirely the point, and in some respects it does hold up better than you might expect, spelt being genuinely high in protein and relatively easily digestible. The point is that she was thinking systematically about food in a way that was remarkable for its depth, and that influenced the practice of healing in her region for generations after her death. She wrote about vegetables, about herbs, about meats and fish, about the specific properties of individual plants and their effects on specific conditions. Her writing on what we would now call the interaction between diet and health was not abstract philosophical reflection. It was intended to be practical, to be used, to inform the choices of those who were responsible for the feeding and healing of others. In the context of a monastic community, where the abbess was responsible for the physical well-being of her sisters, as well as their spiritual direction, this kind of practical medical knowledge was directly relevant to daily life. She wrote about what we might call appetite and digestion, in terms that acknowledge the psychological and emotional dimensions of eating, the way that grief or anxiety or anger affected the body's capacity to process food, the way that the humoral temperament of an individual shaped what foods were appropriate for them. A melancholic person needed different food from a sanguine one. A person running hot in the humoral sense needed cooling foods. A person who was cold and damp needed warming ones. The framework is not one we use now, but the underlying observation that different people respond differently to the same foods, that emotional state affects digestion, that individual constitution matters in determining what nourishes, has more connection to modern understanding than a flat dismissal would suggest. The move to Rupertsberg, which Hildegard undertook in the early 1150s over the considerable resistance of the abbot of Disibodenberg, is worth understanding in the context of everything else about her character. She had a vision, she said, directing her to found a new community on the land near the confluence of the Rhine and Nahe rivers. The abbot was not enthusiastic. The community of women had grown under her leadership, and their presence at Disibodenberg brought resources and prestige to the monastery that would depart with them. Hildegard, faced with institutional resistance, became ill, as she sometimes did when she believed she was being obstructed in something divinely directed. The illness and recovery were understood as confirmation that the move was necessary. The abbot eventually relented. What Hildegard was doing at Rupertsberg beyond the spiritual purpose was establishing independence. The new house was not subordinate to a male monastic authority, in the same way that the community at Disibodenberg had been. She negotiated arrangements that gave the community real autonomy, its own management of its own resources, its own governance of its own life. She founded a second house at Eibingen across the Rhine in the 1160s, effectively creating a small network of communities under her direction. She managed these houses with administrative competence, alongside the writing and the music and the correspondence and the preaching tours that occupied her later decades. The correspondence is where you encounter Hildegard at her most direct. She wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux with the respect due his authority and the frankness of someone who had things to say. She wrote to Pope Eugenius with similar directness, advising him on the state of the Church, which she found wanting in several respects, in language that was softened by appropriate deference, but that did not ultimately obscure what she was saying. She wrote to the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the most powerful secular ruler of her time, advising him on his conduct, warning him when she believed he was making errors, persisting in her engagement with his court, even when the engagement was complicated by his political conflicts with the papacy. Frederick Barbarossa is an interesting case in Hildegard's biography, because the relationship between them was long and complex and did not resolve simply. She believed in imperial authority as a divinely sanctioned structure. She also believed that Frederick was sometimes wrong, and she said so. She wrote to him on at least 3 occasions that survive, including a letter written late in her life when the schism between Frederick and the papacy had created a situation she found deeply concerning. She did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She told him what she believed to be true. The fact that he continued to receive her communications and engage with them suggests that whatever personal authority she had accumulated by this point in her life was enough to make even a Holy Roman Emperor take her letters seriously. She undertook 4 preaching tours in the 1160s and 1170s, travelling through the Rhine Valley and beyond, speaking at cathedrals and monasteries to audiences of clergy and lay people. A woman preaching publicly in the 12th century was not impossible, but it was exceptional enough to require explanation, and Hildegard's explanation was always the same. She was not speaking from her own authority. She was transmitting what the living light had shown her. The prophetic framing allowed her to claim a public voice that the institutional church would not have extended to her simply on the basis of her own learning and judgment, and she used that framing consistently and skillfully throughout her life. She died in September of 1179 in her 81st year, having outlived most of the major figures of her era by a comfortable margin. The community she left behind at Rupertsberg mourned her, and the accounts of her last days suggest that she remained intellectually active and engaged until very close to the end, which would have surprised no one who had been paying attention to the previous 8 decades. The delay in her formal canonization is instructive. Her cause was opened multiple times over the following centuries and stalled multiple times, for reasons that the Vatican has not fully documented, but that likely had something to do with the difficulty of fitting her very particular profile into the available categories of female sanctity, and with the occasional nervousness that her writings generated in readers who found some of her cosmological and theological positions unusual enough to require careful handling. She was finally canonised by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012 and named a Doctor of the Church, joining a list of 37 total doctors that included only 4 women at the time of her addition. What Hildegard represents, in the context of tonight's journey through the medieval world of food and sustenance, and the bodies that processed both, is something that the peasant-eating grey pottage in the field never had access to. Not just the food, though she certainly ate better than the people who worked the land. Not just the education, though the enclosure gave her access to learning that was effectively impossible for most women of her class, and almost all women regardless of class, but the framework, the capacity to think systematically about the relationship between the body, the food, the world, and something she understood as the divine, and to write those thoughts down and to have them taken seriously. The peasant and the visionary were both operating inside the same medieval universe, both shaped by the same broad understandings of the body and its needs, but the resources available to think, to articulate, and to be heard were distributed as unevenly as the bread itself. There is a story about Hildegard that illustrates something essential about her character, and it involves not a vision or a theological debate but a dead man and a cemetery. In the last year of her life, when she was already elderly by any measure of her era, she faced a situation that required her to choose between institutional compliance and what she believed was right. A man had died who had been excommunicated by the church, and he had been buried in the cemetery of her community at Rupertsberg before his death, according to Hildegard, having been reconciled to the church and properly absolved. The local church authorities demanded that the body be exhumed and removed from consecrated ground, because an excommunicated person had no right to burial there, regardless of what the abbess believed about his spiritual state. Hildegard refused. She went further. She went into the cemetery herself and obliterated the marks on the grave so that it could not be identified for exhumation. Then she wrote to the Archbishop of Mainz defending her position, arguing that the man had died in a state of grace, and that she had acted in accordance with her own knowledge of the situation and her own spiritual responsibility for the community in her care. The result was an interdict, a suspension of public religious services at Rupertsberg, which meant that her community could not sing the divine office, could not celebrate Mass, could not perform the musical worship that was so central to Hildegard's understanding of the spiritual life. For a community that had built its existence around the performance of liturgical music, this was not a minor inconvenience. It was a profound deprivation, deliberately imposed. Hildegard maintained her position. She wrote again, this time in more extended terms, arguing not just the specific case but the broader principle, that the punishment of interdict applied to an entire community for the decision of its leader was unjust, and that the silencing of sacred music was itself a kind of spiritual violence. She wrote movingly about the importance of music to the soul, about the voice as the instrument by which human beings reach toward the divine, about what it meant to silence that voice. The interdict was eventually lifted, apparently persuaded by the quality of the argument as much as by any change in circumstances. Hildegard had been elderly, and had refused to move, and had eventually won. It was characteristic. The medical philosophy that runs through Hildegard's writing on food and health is worth tracing in more detail, because it reveals something about how the medieval world understood the relationship between the body and the natural world that is more sophisticated than a flat dismissal would suggest. The 4 humours were understood as dynamic rather than fixed. A person was not simply a sanguine or a choleric type in a rigid and permanent way. They had a dominant humour, an underlying constitution, but the balance could shift in response to season, to diet, to emotion, to illness, to age. The task of maintaining health was the task of managing that balance, and food was one of the primary tools available for doing so. Foods were classified by their humoral properties, their degree of heat and moisture, in a system that was complex enough to require real expertise to navigate. Pepper was hot and dry, cucumber was cold and wet, pork was cold and moist in some classifications, which explained why it needed to be paired with hot spices to balance it, and why the combination of pork and pepper that appears in so many medieval recipes was not just a flavour preference, but a medical argument. The cook who understood humoral theory was not merely feeding people. They were, in the medieval understanding, participating in the maintenance of their health. The skilled cook of a great household, like the skilled physician, was someone who understood the properties of the ingredients and could combine them to produce not just pleasure but benefit. Hildegard's particular contribution to this tradition was the specificity and the range of her observations. She wrote about plants that were native to the Rhineland with the kind of familiarity that comes from having grown up in a landscape and paid close attention to what it produced. She wrote about plants that had come into European medical practice through Arab scholarship, the great inheritance of Greek and Persian medical writing that had been preserved and expanded in the Islamic world and transmitted back to Europe through the Spanish translation movement of the 12th century. She worked at the point where local empirical knowledge and theoretical framework met, and her writing reflects both. Her description of the properties of various meats is particularly interesting in light of what we know about medieval peasant diet. She wrote about the properties of beef, of pork, of various birds, of fish, and she wrote about them with an attention to what they did to the body of the person eating them that went beyond simple classification. She noted that pork, prepared well, was nourishing for those who could tolerate it, but that it needed careful handling and appropriate accompaniment to be beneficial rather than harmful. The heavy reliance on salted pork that characterized peasant winter diet was something she would have had views about, the salt itself being understood in humoral terms as a drying agent, the preserved meat lacking the moisture and vibrancy of fresh food, the combination potentially harsh on the system over a winter's worth of reliance. Whether the peasants whose diet she might have theorized about had access to the corrective measures she would have prescribed is another question, with an obvious answer. The 12th century world of learning in which Hildegard operated was itself undergoing a significant transformation during her lifetime. The influx of translated texts from Arabic and Greek through the Spanish schools of Toledo and through Sicily was introducing a new range of intellectual tools into European thinking. The works of Aristotle, the medical writings of Galen and Avicenna, the philosophical and scientific traditions of Islamic scholarship were becoming available in Latin for the first time and were beginning to reshape what educated Europeans thought was possible to know and how they thought it could be known. Hildegard was working in the early stages of this transformation, before it had fully reshaped the intellectual landscape, and her work reflects both the older monastic tradition of learning and the early influence of the new materials. Her relationship to the tradition of women's religious writing in her century is also worth considering. She was not the only woman writing in a mystical and visionary tradition in 12th century Europe. The movement of female religiosity in the 12th century was considerable, producing a range of figures whose spiritual authority was recognized and whose writings circulated, though generally with more difficulty and more conditionality than those of their male contemporaries. Hildegard was exceptional in the breadth of her work and the security of her institutional position, but she was operating within a landscape where women's spiritual authority was more contested territory than the institutional history sometimes acknowledges. The endorsements she sought and obtained were not guarantees. They were the best available protection in a situation where protection was genuinely needed. The morning you step into now is different from the peasant's morning, though not necessarily easier. You wake early, as everyone in this world wakes early, but you wake to a specific and immediate purpose. The fire you are responsible for is not the fire in a small domestic hearth. It is the fire in the oven, the commercial baking oven that has been your domain and your primary concern for every working day of your adult life. You are a medieval baker, and before anything else, before the skies properly light, you need to know the state of that oven. The oven is the centre of your world in a way that is difficult to overstate. Everything depends on it. The heat must be right. Not a vague general warmth, but the specific, calibrated temperature that comes from years of reading a fire the way a sailor reads weather, through accumulated instinct more than any formal measurement. Because there is no thermometer, there is no dial, there is nothing to consult except your own knowledge, your hand held near the opening, the way the smoke rises, the behaviour of a small piece of flour scattered on the floor of the oven, whether it browns immediately or takes a moment, whether it scorches or simply dries. You have done this enough times that the oven speaks to you in a language that would be invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning it. Getting the oven to the right temperature begins with a fire built inside the oven itself, a long fire of faggots and wood that heats the stone or brick walls over a period of hours. This is not a quick process. The heat must penetrate the mass of the oven itself, storing warmth in the walls that will then radiate back into the baking chamber after the fire is raked out. The timing of when to rake the coals, when the oven has reached its peak, when it is beginning to cool to the right range for bread, and later, as it continues to cool, for the smaller, more delicate things that need lower heat. This is the fundamental skill around which everything else is organised. You cannot buy this skill. You cannot read it from a book. You acquire it through repetition, through failures, through the slow accumulation of experience in the presence of fire, and by the time you are the person your community depends on for bread, you have spent years earning that dependence. You rake the coals into the ash pit. You sweep the floor of the oven clean with a wet cloth wrapped around a long handle, the steam it produces helping to condition the oven's interior. You test the heat with the back of your hand at the opening. Today, it is right. Today, the first batch of loaves can go in. The bread you are making is not for your own household. You are a professional. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You are a professional baker in a medieval town, and this changes everything about the nature of your work. The guild that governs the baking trade has views about almost every aspect of what you do, from the quality of the grain you use to the weight of the loaves you sell, and the guild's views are enforced with a consistency that makes them difficult to misunderstand. The assize of bread, the regulatory framework that governed bread pricing and weight in medieval England from the 13th century, and similar regulations that existed across medieval Europe in various forms, tied the price of bread directly to the price of grain, and specified exactly how much a loaf of a given type must weigh in relation to its selling price. This is not a background administrative fact. This is the most immediate practical reality of your working life, because the punishment for violating the assize was not a fine, or not primarily a fine. It was public humiliation. Specifically, it was the pillory, or in many English towns a practice called the hurdle, where a baker caught selling underweight bread was strapped to a sledge with the offending loaf tied around their neck and dragged through the streets of the town by a horse, past the market, past the neighbours, past the customers who had trusted them, past everyone who would now know exactly what had happened and why. This was not occasional. It was documented in municipal records across medieval England and continental Europe. It happened to bakers who cut corners, who used inferior grain, who let their thumbs sit a little too heavily on the scales at the moment of sale. The public nature of the punishment was intentional. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to communicate something specific to the community, not just that this baker had cheated, but that the bread supply was a matter of serious civic concern, and that those entrusted with it were held to a visible and enforceable standard. Bread was not simply a commodity in the medieval town. It was a basic necessity without which significant portions of the urban population could not survive, and the authorities who regulated it understood its political significance with a clarity that came from knowing exactly what happened to urban populations when the bread supply failed or was compromised. You are aware of this as you load the loaves. You have always been aware of this. The practice of adding a small extra piece of bread to each batch, the inbread or vantage loaf that bakers added to ensure that the full measure was met, even accounting for the natural variation in loaf weight during baking, was not generosity. It was risk management. You added a bit extra because a bit extra was significantly cheaper than a hurdle ride through the main street with yesterday's loaf around your neck. The grain you use comes from the mill, and this is its own web of relationships and obligations. You buy grain directly from farmers who bring it to market, or you receive it from customers who bring their own grain to be baked, a common arrangement in towns where households had grain from their own landholding, or from purchases but lacked the means or space to bake it themselves. The customer brought you grain. You kept a portion, called the baking fee, and returned to them a corresponding weight of bread. The relationship with the miller was one you maintained carefully, because the quality of the flour you received determined the quality of what you could produce, and the quality of what you could produce determined your reputation, and your reputation in a medieval town's commercial world was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between steady trade and slow ruin. The different grades of bread tell you something important about the social structure of the food supply, because they were not simply quality grades in the modern sense. They were status indicators that mapped directly onto the social hierarchy of the town's population. Westall bread was a fine white bread made from highly sifted wheat flour, light and expensive, and not remotely the daily bread of ordinary people. The sifting process that produced white flour also produced bran as a byproduct, and what the wealthy ate was the refined centre of the grain, while the outer layers went elsewhere, to the bread of lower quality, to animal feed, to whatever use could be found for them. Cocket bread was slightly less refined. Simnel bread was also made from fine wheat, baked in a particular way that involved boiling or partial pre-cooking before the final baking. Then you bake for the range of customers who come to your stall or your shop, adjusting to what they can afford, working through the morning as the oven moves through its heat cycle, from the highest temperature down through the lower registers. The white bread goes in first when the heat is at its peak, and needs careful watching because it browns quickly, and an overbaked fine loaf is a waste of expensive flour. Then the darker bread, more forgiving of temperature variation, less expensive, more of it sold. Then the pies and pastries if you make them, using the residual warmth as the oven cools through the afternoon. By mid-morning the first batches are out, and the smell of fresh bread in the street around your shop is doing its own work. Smell is one of the most powerful marketing tools available to a medieval baker, not because they thought of it as marketing, but because the simple reality of fresh bread's aroma drawing hungry people off their course and toward the source of it has never required explanation. People stop. People buy. People decide that they had been meaning to pick up bread today anyway. The smell is not accidental, and the baker who chose a street-facing shop with good ventilation understood something practical about the relationship between nose and commerce. The guild structures that governed baking require more attention than they usually receive, because they were not simply regulatory bodies in the way that modern professional associations are. The guild was a total social institution for its members, combining the functions that in a modern world are distributed across employers, professional associations, mutual insurance societies, social clubs, and religious brotherhoods. You paid dues to the guild. The guild paid benefits to members who fell sick, to the widows of members who died, to members whose businesses had been damaged by fire or other catastrophe. The guild maintained a chapel and funded masses for the souls of deceased members. The guild held feasts and ceremonies and processed through the town on the feast day of its patron saint, and these were not optional social extras. They were the fabric of your professional and communal identity. The apprenticeship system that fed the guild with its members was also significant. A young person apprenticed to a baker, typically for a period of 7 years in the English tradition, entered a years-long education in the management of fire, grain, and dough, in the economics of the trade, in the physical rhythms of a working life organised entirely around the needs of the oven. The apprentice did not simply learn to bake. The apprentice learned what it meant to be a baker, the totality of the trade's demands, its social obligations, its seasonal variations, its economic structure. By the time the apprenticeship ended and a journeyman baker was ready to work independently, or save toward establishing their own operation, the skills accumulated were genuinely substantial, technical and observational and relational all at once. The question of who baked bread in the medieval world is more complicated than the image of the professional male baker suggests. In rural areas and in smaller towns, domestic bread baking was primarily a female task, as it had been for most of human history. Women managed the grain, managed the fire, managed the household food production that included bread alongside everything else. The professional baking trade that developed in larger towns and cities as urbanization created concentrations of people who did not have their own land or their own ovens was indeed predominantly male in its guild-organized form, though women worked as assistants and some worked as independent bakers, particularly in smaller operations or in the selling of bread. The guild records that survive are complex on this point, showing women's involvement in ways that the official structure often does not fully account for. Your hands at the end of the day are a document of this work. Flour in the cracks around your knuckles that no amount of washing will fully remove. A particular callus from the long-handled peel used to slide loaves in and out of the oven. The slight redness on your forearms from years of proximity to heat. The occasional burn mark from an incautious moment near the oven opening. A baker's body looks like what a baker does, which is to say it looks like fire and dough and the particular physical intelligence of a trade that cannot be learned from a book and cannot be faked. You close up at the end of the day and you think briefly about tomorrow, which will begin in the same place this one began. The oven, in the dark before the light, waiting for you to bring it back. There is something about that continuity, about the constancy of the oven as the fixed point around which everything else rotates, that is almost meditative if you are in the right frame of mind for it. The same task, repeated, refined. The small adjustments that are the only form of mastery available in work like this. Not dramatic improvement, not sudden revelation, just the slow deepening of understanding that comes from doing the same thing well, over and over, in the presence of fire and flour, in the service of a town that needs to eat. The oven will be here tomorrow, the grain will need to be measured, and the fire will need to be read, and the loaves will need to be watched. And you will be here too, because the bread does not make itself, and because this is who you are, in the precise and functional sense that this is what you do, and what you know, and what the town depends on you to do. The baker who was here before you did this work. The baker who will come after you will do it too. The oven does not keep time in the way that people keep time, it simply waits to be needed, and it is always needed, and you are there. This is why the oven was the centre of the baker's world in a way that no modern appliance quite captures. The oven had a personality, in the practical sense that it behaved in ways that required learning. A new baker using an unfamiliar oven would make mistakes that an experienced baker with the same oven would not, because the behaviour was specific. This particular oven, in this particular place, built with this particular material by this particular builder, behaved in a way that you learned through experience. The way the heat distributed, whether it was hotter toward the back or the sides, how quickly it lost temperature in cold weather, how the door seal affected the atmosphere inside, these were things you knew about your oven. The way you knew about a difficult animal, through observation, through experience, through the accumulated knowledge of enough mornings that the knowledge became reflexive. The range of things a baker was expected to produce in a medieval town went beyond the simple loaves that form the central image of the trade. Pies were a significant part of the baker's output in many areas, because the oven capable of producing bread was also the appropriate instrument for producing pastry-encased fillings, and pie production required both the baking infrastructure and the access to ingredients that the baker's trade connections provided. The range of fillings available varied considerably by season and by the wealth of the customer, from simple vegetable preparations to meat pies, fish pies on days when meat was restricted, egg and cheese fillings, and the more elaborate constructions that wealthy customers might commission for specific occasions. The distinction between the professional baker in the town and the domestic bread production of rural households is worth exploring, because it maps onto a broader pattern of medieval economic organisation in which specialisation and commercial production concentrated in urban areas, while rural households continued to perform many tasks that their urban counterparts had given over to the market. In the countryside, bread was a household product managed primarily by women. In the town, it was a commercial product managed primarily by men operating within a guild structure. This is not simply a gender distinction, though gender was part of it. It is a distinction between two different modes of economic organisation that were developing simultaneously, and that would eventually, over centuries, resolve in favour of the commercial model. But in the medieval period they coexisted, with urban bakers serving an urban population and rural households baking for themselves, and the boundary between the two systems was porous in the way that most historical boundaries are. The economic life of a medieval baker was bound to the grain market in ways that made planning very difficult. The price of grain fluctuated with the harvest, with transport costs, with the political situations that affected trade routes, with the weather patterns that affected growing conditions across regions that supplied the local market. A baker who bought grain when it was cheap and baked and sold bread at a regulated price tied to the current market might find the calculation working in their favour one year and against them the next. The assize attempted to maintain this balance, adjusting the allowed price and weight of bread in response to grain price movements. But the adjustments were not always timely, and the relationship between grain cost and bread price was never perfectly smooth. There was also the question of the mill. The miller occupied a position in the medieval food chain that was simultaneously central and viewed with suspicion. The miller controlled access to the flour that the baker needed, and the miller's compensation came in kind as a portion of the flour they processed. The opportunities for dishonesty were obvious and well recognised by the medieval community, well recognised enough that the dishonest miller became a stock character in medieval literature. The Canterbury Tales makes a point of establishing one of its characters as a miller with a variety of untrustworthy characteristics, because the audience would have recognised the type immediately. bakers and millers worked in a relationship of mutual dependency and mutual wariness that the small margins of both trades did nothing to ease. The baker's week was structured by the religious calendar in ways that shaped both the type of bread required and the volume of trade. Fridays and the various fast days of the church restricted meat eating, which drove up demand for bread and fish. The great feasts of the church calendar brought customers who were entertaining and who needed more bread of better quality. Lent was a period when the religious restrictions on diet were at their most comprehensive, and the baker, who had built a trade in enriched breads made with butter and eggs, as some did, had to adjust their production for the Lenten period when those ingredients were restricted. The relationship between the baker and the surrounding neighbourhood was one of recognised mutual dependency, and in many medieval towns this dependency was formalised in the spatial organisation of the trade. Bakers' streets and bakers' quarters existed in many large towns, not simply because bakers clustered together by preference, but because the fire risk of the oven was significant enough to make it sensible to put all the fire-using trades in proximity to each other and away from the wooden-framed residential areas most vulnerable to fire spread. The great fires that periodically devastated medieval towns were genuine catastrophes, and their prevention was a civic concern, which meant that the bakehouse was subject to fire regulations and inspections in many towns, adding another layer of oversight to the baker's already heavily regulated existence. The relationship between the professional baker and the wider food economy of the medieval town was more complex than the simple transaction of baking and selling suggests. An understanding that complexity tells you something important about how medieval urban economies actually functioned. The baker was not simply a craftsman producing a product and selling it. The baker was a node in a system of relationships that extended from the grain farmer in the surrounding countryside, through the miller and the grain merchant to the baker's stall in the market, and from there to the households of the town's population at every level of the social hierarchy. The grain merchant was a significant figure in this economy, someone who bought grain in volume from farmers at harvest time, when prices were low, and sold it to millers and bakers throughout the year, at prices that reflected storage costs, risk, and market demand. The relationship between the grain merchant and the baker was one of the ongoing economic negotiations that characterized medieval urban commerce, conducted within a framework of regulation that tried to ensure prices remained within bounds that the consuming population could bear, but which operated in reality with all the friction and complexity of any market where supply, demand, and the interests of multiple parties had to be balanced against each other. The summer months brought their own particular pressure to the baker's business. Grain from the previous year's harvest was running low, new grain was not yet in, and prices at the top of the annual cycle could push the regulated bread price to a level where the smallest and poorest buyers struggled to afford even the most basic loaf. The authorities who managed the assize were supposed to adjust the regulations to maintain access for the poor, and they sometimes did. But the mechanics of adjusting and communicating price changes across a town's baking trade were slow by modern standards, and the gap between the theoretical protection of the assize and the practical reality of bread prices in a lean summer was real enough to produce genuine hardship. Bakers were also involved in the credit economy of the medieval town in ways that are not always recognised. Small customers who ran short of money before payday, or before the next market day, could run a tab with a regular baker, receiving bread on credit against future payment. This was not a formal financial product. It was a relationship, the kind of ongoing and formal credit that characterized economic life at every level of the medieval economy, from the great merchants who extended credit across international trade routes down to the baker, who allowed a known and trusted customer to take bread today and pay for it tomorrow. The book of debts that many traders maintained, the tally sticks that recorded credit transactions, the informal ledgers of local commerce. These were the nervous system of an economy that operated largely on trust and relationship as much as on immediate cash exchange. The seasonal variation in the baker's workload was significant. The post-harvest period when grain was plentiful and cheap was a time of high production volume and potentially better margins for the baker who had bought grain at harvest prices and was now selling bread at the regulated rate. The pre-harvest period when grain was expensive and scarce was a period of pressure and reduced margins, when the baker who had not planned carefully might find themselves producing bread at a price that barely covered costs. The skill of managing a bakery through the annual grain price cycle was as important as the skill of managing the oven, and the bakers who survived and prospered over multiple decades were those who had mastered both. The physical structure of the bakehouse itself was subject to regulation and inspection in many medieval towns, and the records of those inspections tell us something about the conditions the bakers worked in and the standards their communities held them to. The oven had to be maintained in a condition that produced clean bread, meaning not bread contaminated by dirty coals or ash from a poorly managed fire, and the storage of grain and flour had to meet standards that prevented contamination from pests, moisture, or the wrong kind of neighbour. A bakehouse adjacent to a tanning yard or a slaughterhouse was a problem, not just in an aesthetic sense, but in the practical sense that contamination of flour was a real risk in close quarters. The apprentice's experience of the bakehouse was a comprehensive education in the realities of the trade as well as its skills. An apprentice who arrived in a baker's household expecting to learn only the mechanics of bread production would find themselves also learning the economics of grain buying, the management of customer relationships, the negotiation with the guild, the navigation of municipal regulations, and the physical endurance that the work required. The master baker's household was the apprentice's home for the duration of the apprenticeship, and the relationship between them was not simply that of employer and employee. It was closer to the relationship of a member of the household, with all the obligations and benefits that implied in a world where household membership carried real social and economic significance. The female members of the baker's household were part of the operation in ways that the guild records, which focused on the male master, sometimes obscure. The wife of a master baker typically managed the selling side of the business, the stall or the shop from which bread was sold, the customer relationships, the collection of payments, the management of the daily commercial interactions that the baker himself was too occupied at the oven to handle. The alewife tradition that produced independent female commercial bakers in some towns operated within a space that the guild structure imperfectly governed, and the records of bakers' widows who continued to operate their deceased husbands' businesses after the death, sometimes for years, suggest that the practical knowledge of the trade was not confined to the man whose name appeared on the guild records. The image that comes to mind when most people think of medieval food is a feast, and it is a specific feast, the kind that cinema and television have polished into a comfortable shorthand. A long table in a great hall, lit by torchlight and candle, covered in an abundance that seems almost deliberate in its excess. Whole animals on platters, towers of pies, musicians in the gallery, goblets raised, the lord at the centre of it all, presiding over something that looks like the physical embodiment of power made edible. The feast was real. That part requires acknowledgement before the complications begin, because the medieval feast was a genuine institution with deep roots in the social and political life of the period, and dismissing it as purely theatrical would miss something important about how power was organised and communicated in a world that did not have broadcast media or printed news. The feast was communication. It was political messaging delivered in courses. And understanding what was actually served, why it was served, who was doing the serving, and what the guests understood about what they were eating, requires understanding that food in the medieval world was a language, and like all languages it had grammar, syntax, and a great many things it was possible to say that were invisible to those who did not speak it fluently. The medieval feast as it existed in the great households of kings, nobles, and bishops was not an undifferentiated abundance available equally to all who attended. It was a carefully stratified experience in which the quality, quantity, and specific type of food served to each person at the table communicated their position in the hierarchy with a precision that would have been legible to everyone present. You sat where your status placed you, and you ate what your status entitled you to, and the distance between where you sat and where the most important person in the room sat was measurable in the quality of the food that arrived at your place. The high table was the literal and social apex. The lord or king, his immediate family, and his most honoured guests ate there, elevated above the rest of the hall on a raised dais that made the social hierarchy visible as architecture. What they ate was different from what everyone else received, not just in quantity, though quantity was part of it, but in quality, in the specific items served, and above all in the spicing. Spices were the single most significant marker of culinary status in the medieval feast, and understanding this requires understanding the medieval spice trade and what it meant to access it. Spices came from the east, pepper from the Malabar coast of what is now India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, ginger from multiple Asian origins, cloves from the Moluccas, the spice islands of what is now Indonesia, remote enough that the plant from which cloves come was unknown in Europe until explorers brought back descriptions of it in the Age of Exploration, nutmeg from the same archipelago, saffron from the crocus fields of Spain, Persia and Asia Minor, the most labour-intensive spice in the world to produce because each thread had to be hand-harvested from the flower that bore it. The trade routes that brought these to Europe were long, expensive and controlled by a sequence of intermediaries who each added to the cost. By the time a quantity of pepper or cinnamon reached a great household in England or France or Germany, it had passed through merchants in the Levant, in the Italian city-states, through the hands of multiple traders, each of whom had taken their share. The result: if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The result was that spices were extremely expensive, and their presence in food was a direct signal of expenditure. A dish heavily flavoured with saffron was not just a dish that tasted of saffron, it was a visible declaration of financial capacity. The gold colour of saffron-tinted food was itself a kind of economic statement. The most expensive spice in the world displayed on the plates of those who could afford to use it as a cooking ingredient rather than as a medicine or a luxury for special occasions only. When a medieval recipe calls for generous quantities of multiple spices in a single dish, the modern reader is looking at instructions for producing something that would have communicated wealth as plainly as the silver plate it was served on. The high table received the spiced and sauced and elaborately prepared dishes. The further from the high table you sat, the plainer the food became, until at the lower reaches of the hall you were eating something that resembled, more than anything else, the basic fare of everyday life: bread, boiled meats or pottage, perhaps preserved fish, without the layers of spice and sauce and presentation that were reserved for those whose social position entitled them to eat well. This was not accidental. This was the system operating as intended. The feast performed hierarchy the same way that the physical arrangement of the hall performed it, the same way that clothing and armour and heraldic display performed it. Every element of a great feast was a declaration of social order, and the food was no different. Possibly more efficient than most, because you could not fake the presence of saffron. Saffron cost what it cost, and the people who received it knew what it cost, and the knowledge was part of the meal. The surviving cookbooks from the medieval period, the most significant of which include the Forma of Cury, compiled by the master cooks of Richard II of England in the 1390s, the Viandier associated with the French master cook Taille Vent, the Italian Libro d'arte coquinaria of the later 15th century, and others from Germany, Catalonia and various parts of northern Europe, reveal a cuisine that was interested in complexity, in layered flavours, in the combining of sweet and savoury elements that a modern palate sometimes finds unexpected. The combination of fruit and meat in the same preparation was not unusual, and was not considered a category error. It reflected the humoral understanding that sweet flavours had specific properties in relation to hot or cold meats, and that the combination produced a dish that was both pleasurable and appropriately balanced in its effects on the body. A sauce made from verjuice and sugar and ginger served over roasted poultry was a specific thing, and it was not a simple thing. The cook who made it was working with skill and intention, and a practical philosophy of flavour that had internal logic. The guest who received it understood what they were tasting, in the sense that they understood the ingredients and what they signified. The sharpness of the verjuice cutting through the richness of the meat, the warmth of the ginger providing the heat element, the sugar balancing both. Whether they could have articulated the humoral theory behind the construction is another question, but the experience of it was coherent, and the experience was the point. The presentation of food at great feasts was as important as the content, and in some cases more important. The subtlety, an elaborate confection made from sugar paste or marzipan or almond paste, sculpted into heraldic forms, animals, castles, ships, allegorical figures, and presented at significant moments in the feast, was a piece of political and cultural communication, as much as it was a food item. The sugar itself was expensive, a luxury import that shared the spice trade's price structure. The skill required to sculpt it into recognisable and elaborate forms was the product of specialised training. The heraldic imagery it depicted spoke directly to the literate and heraldry audience at the high table, announcing alliances, celebrating victories, complimenting guests. When a subtlety depicted the arms of a visiting noble, it was saying something specific about how valued that guest was, and how much the host had invested in demonstrating that value. The pies that feature so prominently in the imagery of medieval feasting were also real, and also more complicated than they appear. The pastry casing of a medieval pie was often not intended to be eaten. It was a coffin in the technical sense of the word, a container, a way of cooking and presenting the filling in a form that held its shape and concentrated its juices during cooking. The pastry was made from a very stiff plain dough that served as a cooking vessel and a serving dish rather than as a component of the meal itself. The guest received the filling. The pastry shell was often distributed afterward, to the servants, to the poor at the gate, to whatever practical use could be found for a baked flour container that had absorbed the cooking juices of something expensive. Understanding this changes the image somewhat, from spectacular abundance to a more rational system of presentation and distribution that repurposed every element efficiently, because even in households of significant wealth, waste was not a neutral act and had social meaning of its own. The sauces that accompanied roasted and boiled meats at a great feast were a significant culinary accomplishment. The medieval cook working at the highest level of the trade was a sophisticated practitioner of flavour combinations and technical skill. The use of thickening agents, ground almonds being particularly common in upper-class cooking, producing what were called white sauces of a colour and texture quite different from the starch-thickened sauces of later cooking traditions. The almond milk that appeared in numerous recipes was not a modern health food product, but a practical ingredient made by grinding blanched almonds and pressing them with hot water, producing a white liquid that had a richness and body useful in both savoury and sweet preparations, and that was also conveniently acceptable on fast days when dairy was restricted. The kitchen that produced all of this was an organised and hierarchical operation in any great household, and the organisational structure tells you something about how seriously the production of food was taken in the medieval aristocratic world. The kitchens of a major lord or bishop employed numbers of people sufficient to constitute a small business, and the hierarchy of the kitchen mirrored the hierarchy of the hall it served. At the top was the master cook, a figure of genuine authority and standing, who bore responsibility for the quality and timing and organisation of everything that came out of the kitchen. Below them were the cooks responsible for specific tasks, the roasting cook, the sauce cook, the pastry cook in larger establishments. Below them were the assistants, the kitchen boys, the scullery workers. These people ate after the feast was finished. The kitchen workers, the servers, the scullery staff who cleaned the vessels and carried the water and kept the fires going. They ate the food that remained when the hall was finished with it, which was sometimes substantial in great households where overproduction was preferable to the appearance of insufficiency, but which was not the same food in the same presentation that had been served above. This distinction was understood by everyone in the household. It was another layer of the hierarchy that the feast expressed, and it was maintained with the same consistency as the seating arrangement in the hall itself. The service of the meal was itself a performance with political and social content. The carving of meat at the table, performed by a skilled carver whose ability to reduce a roasted animal into properly portioned pieces was a genuine and valued skill, was done in public in great households, often by a gentleman or even a noble who understood that performing this service for the Lord was not demeaning, but was an expression of loyalty and close service. The pantler who managed the bread, the ewer who managed the hand-washing water and linens, the butler who managed the wine and ale, these were roles with defined protocols, and the protocols were not arbitrary. They expressed relationships, obligations, the precise social choreography of a world in which how you served expressed who you were and where you stood. The grace before meals in a great household was a formal ceremony, a public religious act that framed the feast as something more than simple consumption. Almsgiving was often connected to feast days, the formal distribution of food or money to the poor at the gate of a great house on significant occasions, which served both genuine charitable purpose and the important social function of demonstrating the Lord's generosity in a visible and widely witnessed way. The feast was never only about the people in the hall, it was also about the people who knew the feast was happening and what it said about the Lord who held it. The gap between the image and the reality of the medieval feast is not simply a gap between wealth and poverty, though it is that too. It is a gap between what the occasion was designed to show and what was actually required to produce it, between the visibility of the consumption and the invisibility of the labour, between the message the food was sending to those who received it and the experience of those who spent their lives making it possible. Medieval society was extremely skilled at constructing visible images of power and abundance, and very practiced at making invisible the systems that maintained those images. The feast, in its full complexity, is one of the clearest expressions of that practice. The food was real, the abundance for some was real, the magnificence was real. But the image of natural plenty that the feast projected, the sense that this abundance arose simply from the greatness of the Lord, rather than from the organised, skilled, relentless labour of people who would eat their supper in the kitchen after the guests had gone, was a construction carefully maintained, and the people whose work maintained it were eating something considerably more modest when the great hall finally went quiet. The logistics behind a great medieval feast are worth spending some time with, because they reveal something important about what the feast actually was as an institution, separate from what it looked like. To hold a great feast in a major noble or royal household was not a matter of deciding to have dinner on a larger scale. It was a logistical operation of considerable complexity that required planning, supply chains, skilled labour, and the management of perishable ingredients in a world without refrigeration, all under time pressure and with the expectation of consistent quality at the highest level. The provisioning of a great feast began weeks or months in advance. Live animals had to be purchased, transported, and held until needed. The spice merchant had to be engaged. The wine merchant had to be consulted because the wine for a great feast came from a range of sources that required selection and storage, and good wine in a medieval great house was treated with some of the reverence that a modern host might give to a carefully chosen cellar. Dried fruits, almonds, sugar, and the range of imported ingredients that characterized upper-class cooking all had to be sourced from the specialist merchants who controlled their supply. The great household maintained permanent kitchen staff, but for a feast of significant scale, additional labour was often hired. Specialist cooks with particular skills might be brought in for the occasion. The ordinary cooking staff who managed daily meals operated at a different scale than the feast kitchen, and the transition from one to the other required management and coordination. The master cook who presided over this operation was not simply a skilled practitioner of their craft. They were a manager, a logistics coordinator, a quality controller, and a communicator, responsible for translating the Lord's expectations into organised production and for managing the considerable number of people and the significant amount of material that the feast required. The physical organisation of the great medieval kitchen is preserved in some cases in surviving buildings and in the descriptions in household records and in the architectural traces of large establishments. The kitchen of a major castle or episcopal palace was often a large separate building, not integrated into the main hall but connected by a covered passage that allowed food to be carried to the serving area, sometimes called the buttery or the pantry, without going through the open air. The separate building was a fire precaution as much as anything else. A kitchen fire in a wooden great house was a catastrophe. In a stone kitchen building, it was still serious but more contained. The technology of the medieval kitchen was not as primitive as it is sometimes depicted. Large roasting fireplaces with adjustable spits, mechanical turn-spit mechanisms in some establishments that used the rising warm air of the fire to drive a simple mechanism that rotated the spit without constant manual effort, smoke hoods and louvers designed to manage the airflow and reduce the heat in the kitchen, slightly from its natural condition of overwhelming, ranges of ghee ovens for different baking purposes alongside the open hearths for boiling and roasting. The kitchen staff worked in conditions that were genuinely extreme by any measure. The heat of a working kitchen in the summer months, in a building designed around a large open fire, was not merely uncomfortable. It was a physical challenge that required acclimatization and that took a real toll on the bodies of those who worked there. The question of preservation deserves more attention in the context of the feast, because a feast was only partly about the food that was produced fresh on the day. A significant proportion of what appeared on the table at a great feast had been preserved in some form: the smoked and salted meats, the dried fruits, the preserved fish, the pickled vegetables and condiments that served as accompaniments, and that extended the apparent variety of the table beyond what the immediate season and the immediate market could supply. The feast table was the culmination of a year-round preservation operation, with the household stores managed to ensure that sufficient variety was available when needed. The fish on the feast table deserves particular attention because the Church's dietary regulations made fish one of the most complex categories in the medieval food economy. On fast days and throughout Lent, meat was prohibited and fish was permitted, which meant that fish had to be available in reliable supply for significant portions of the year. Fresh fish was available to those near rivers, lakes, or the sea, and the inland fish ponds maintained by wealthy households and religious establishments were exactly what they sound like: managed water bodies stocked with carp and other freshwater fish that could be netted when needed, a form of living pantry that provided fresh fish on demand regardless of season. For households not so equipped, preserved fish was the answer, and the scale of the medieval preserved fish trade was enormous. Herrings, dried and salted and smoked and pickled in various combinations, travelled from the great fishing grounds of the North Sea and the Baltic across the entirety of inland Europe. Stockfish, cod dried in the cold air of Scandinavia without salt, were as hard as boards and required extended soaking before they became edible, but they kept almost indefinitely, and were the basis of a trade that connected the far north with every inland community that had access to the roads and rivers by which they travelled. Salted cod, or bacalhau in the Mediterranean tradition, was an ancient preservation technology that produced a product storable for months and used in cuisines across the continent. The Lenten herring, which appears in account books and meal records with a frequency that speaks to both the religious requirement and the practical economics of the trade, was the background note of the medieval food economy, unglamorous, essential, and everywhere. The wine on the feast table operated according to its own hierarchy, and the hierarchy of wine at a medieval feast was as carefully calibrated as the hierarchy of food. Wine came from the vineyards of France primarily, from Bordeaux in the English trade, from Burgundy and the Rhineland, from the south of France, from Iberia, and in smaller quantities from further east. The best wine was recent, since medieval wine did not age as well as modern wine without the addition of sulfur compounds that modern producers use and medieval producers did not. New wine from a good vintage was a genuine luxury, served to the high table with the same deliberate communication of status that the spiced food conveyed. Ale continued to be consumed in great quantities, even in households that could afford wine, partly for cultural reasons and partly because ale was produced locally, and was therefore fresh and reliable in ways that imported wine, subject to the vagaries of shipping, storage, and the quality of the barrels, was not always. The hierarchy of beverages at the feast reflected the hierarchy of the guests in the same way that the hierarchy of food did. The fine wines at the high table, the ordinary ale further down, and the arrangement communicated as clearly as the seating plan what the host thought of each section of the company. The role of the pantler, the officer responsible for the bread at the feast, is a small but revealing detail. In a great household, the person who cut and presented the bread to the lord at table was not a kitchen servant. They were a household officer of some standing, and the ritual of presenting the lord with his bread was a formalised act of service that expressed the relationship between the officer and the lord as much as it fulfilled a practical function. The bread itself was placed on the table in a particular way, covered with a cloth until it was to be consumed, handled with the clean linen that signified appropriate care for the person being served. These protocols were not arbitrary. They were expressions of respect and of the social relationship between server and served, and they were taken seriously by the people performing them. The way disease moved through a medieval community in ways directly connected to the food supply is a thread worth following, because it connects the peasant's diet to the broader structure of medieval mortality in ways that the history of great plagues sometimes overshadows. The everyday illnesses of medieval rural life were often food-related in the most direct sense, not from a single catastrophic source, but from the accumulated effects of a diet that was chronically low in certain nutrients, seasonally inadequate and often contaminated by the imperfect preservation and storage conditions of the household. Scurvy, the result of vitamin C deficiency, was a winter and late spring condition that affected communities whose winter diet was so limited in fresh plant food that the body's stores of the vitamin were exhausted before the spring growth resumed. The symptoms, bleeding gums, weakness, joint pain, old wounds reopening, were recognised without being understood, and the practical response to them, the preservation of certain foods for winter use, the cultivation of parsley and other vitamin-containing plants specifically for their winter properties, represented an empirical working around of a problem whose mechanism was not understood for several more centuries. Pellagra, the result of niacin deficiency, was a condition associated with a diet heavily reliant on maize in the later period when that crop spread through Europe. but niacin deficiency from other sources was possible in the medieval period in communities where the diet was extremely narrowly grain-based. The general picture of a population managing on marginal nutrition and experiencing the range of deficiency conditions that marginality produces is consistent with both the documentary record and the archaeological evidence, and it is worth holding in mind as a background condition against which the specific food history of any medieval community should be understood. The herbal knowledge that supplemented the formal medical tradition in medieval communities was often concentrated in women, the herb wives, and wise women and midwives, whose practical knowledge of the plants in their local landscape gave them the tools to address a range of common conditions with preparations that had real, if empirically understood, effects. The overlap between the kitchen garden and the medicinal garden was not always a sharp line. Many plants occupied both domains, used in cooking for their flavour and in medicine for their specific properties, the distinction between a culinary use and a medicinal use being less clear in a world where the humoral framework connected both. The practice of adding specific herbs to food because they were believed to aid digestion or correct a particular imbalance was not irrational given the framework available, and some of the plants used in these ways did have real physiological effects that went beyond the placebo. The miller's role in the food chain deserves extended attention because it was so thoroughly central to the entire system. You could grow the grain, you could preserve the grain, but you could not eat the grain without processing it, and processing it meant the mill. The watermill and the windmill, the two technologies that dominated medieval grain milling, were capital-intensive infrastructure that individual households could not provide for themselves. They were built and owned by lords, by monasteries, by wealthy urban merchants who had the resources to construct them, and their owners charged for the use of them in the way that all medieval infrastructure owners charged for access to what they controlled. The miller's dishonesty was a medieval joke, a medieval proverb, a medieval literary character type, because the miller's position in the grain chain gave them opportunities for petty fraud that everyone understood and that were difficult to prevent entirely. The grain that a customer brought to be ground entered the miller's control. The flour that emerged was returned, minus the miller's toll and the question of whether the toll taken was fair, whether the scales were accurate, whether the proportion claimed was the proportion actually taken, was not always easy to verify. The medieval response to this problem was not to eliminate millers, but to attempt to regulate them, to require the use of sealed weights and measures, to appoint inspectors, to establish the principle that the toll was fixed and known in advance, and to punish millers caught in dishonesty with the same public severity that caught bakers. Whether this kept millers honest across the board is another question, but it kept honest millers from being at a competitive disadvantage relative to dishonest ones, which was perhaps the best available outcome. The journey that grain made from field to bread was, in a significant sense, the journey of medieval food security, and every step of that journey was a potential point of failure or extraction. The field itself was subject to weather, disease, and the competing claims of the feudal system on its yield. The harvest was subject to the efficiency of the labour available and the timeliness of the weather. The transport of grain from field to storage was subject to loss in transit, to the condition of the roads, to the availability of animals to carry or pull it. The mill was subject to the miller's reliability and the maintenance of the mill machinery, which could break down and could not always be quickly repaired. The bakehouse was subject to the baker's skill, the quality of the fuel, and the regulatory environment. And finally, the bread that emerged from all of this was subject to the economic capacity of the buyer to pay for it. This is a long chain with many links, and every link was a place where something could go wrong, where the margin could narrow further, where the bread that finally reached the person who needed it could be less than it needed to be. Understanding this is understanding the medieval food system not as a simple or primitive thing, but as a complex and managed system that was doing its best to feed a large number of people using the technologies and organisational structures available to it, and that was doing so under conditions of chronic scarcity, significant political extraction, and periodic environmental catastrophe. The people who managed that system, from the peasant reading the sky for signs of the harvest weather to the baker, reading the oven for the right moment to pull the bread, were doing skilled work under difficult conditions, and the food they produced and consumed, grey and monotonous and nutritionally marginal as it often was, represented the output of a system of considerable ingenuity and resilience. The feast at the end of the scale represents not the opposite of this system, but its apex, the concentrated wealth produced by the labour and extraction of the base flowing upward through the feudal hierarchy until it arrived at the high table in the form of saffron and venison and sugar subtleties. That concentration was visible, it was meant to be visible, and the visibility of it, the sheer, unarguable, gold-coloured, spice-scented display of what the system had made possible at the top was itself a form of power, a demonstration that the hierarchy worked, that wealth flowed upward as it was supposed to, and that those at the top of the system had arrived there by some combination of divine will and hereditary right that made their possession of the feast appropriate, and the peasant's possession of the pottage appropriate as well, in its way. That was the ideology. The reality, as we have been tracing all evening, was rather more complicated, more fragile, more dependent on the labour and the knowledge and the endurance of the people who produced the grain, and milled the flour and baked the bread and kept the fires going. The feast required the pottage, it required the baker's oven, it required the miller's wheel and the peasant's strips and the draft animals, and the long days of summer labour and the careful management of winter stores. And all of that required more than anything the willingness of a very large number of people to continue doing the work that the system demanded of them, day after day, season after season, for lives that offered them the pottage and kept the feast for others. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. There is something that stays with you after spending a night in the medieval world of food. Not just the food itself, but the understanding of what food was doing in that world beyond the simple business of sustaining the body. It was performing status, enforcing hierarchy, communicating power, and marking the boundaries between those who had enough and those who were managing on what remained after the system had taken its share. The peasant eating pottage before dawn and the lord eating saffron-gilded subtleties at the feast were both participating in the same food system, just from very different positions within it. The baker between them was making the bread that both needed, regulated tightly, watched closely, operating inside the rules with just enough margin to sustain their trade and not quite enough to forget how quickly that margin could shift. And Hildegard in her cell, thinking about spelt and the properties of herbs and the relationship between the body and the food it runs on, was doing something that none of the others were doing, or at least not in the same way. She was naming the system, examining it, writing it down in a form that could outlast the people who lived inside it. She was taking the relationship between what we eat and who we are, and treating it as a subject worthy of serious attention, which it had always been, and which she was one of the few people of her time with both the access and the authority to say out loud. What is worth sitting with tonight as the day's noise settles and the air in the room gets quieter is how much of this still lives in the world around us. The gap between the food that signals wealth and the food that signals its absence is not a medieval phenomenon that was resolved when the medieval period ended. The systems that determine who eats what and how much, and with what degree of choice, are not historical relics. The bodies that carry the record of those systems in ways that persist long after the individual lives are gone. In the archaeology of bones and in the epidemiology of modern health statistics, these patterns are continuous. The people who make the feast possible and are not invited to it exist in every century. The medieval world thought about food with a seriousness that we sometimes flatten into nostalgia or dismiss as ignorance. But the humoral framework that tied food to health, the regulatory apparatus that tied bread to civic stability, the feast that tied food to political communication, these were systems with internal logic, evolved over centuries, responsive to the conditions of a world where the margin between enough and not enough was narrow and real, and felt in the body every single day. They were wrong about many things by the standards of later knowledge. The humours were not real in the biological sense. The assize was enforced in ways that were sometimes more about protecting the wealthy from the consequences of high grain prices than about ensuring the poor could eat. The feast was a display of power as much as a celebration of anything. But they were not wrong to take food seriously. They were not wrong to understand that what you eat and how you get it and who decides are questions that go all the way down into the structure of the world you live in. They built regulatory systems around bread because they knew bread mattered. They built medical frameworks around food because they understood that the body and what you put into it were not separate questions. They built the feast as communication, because they understood that sharing a table was never only about nutrition, that it was about belonging and exclusion, and the demonstration of who had the power to offer plenty. Tonight we have eaten grey pottage and old rye bread. We have followed a visionary through the enclosure and out the other side into one of the most improbable intellectual careers of the 12th century, a woman who thought systematically about the relationship between food and the body, and who said what she thought to emperors and popes, and managed to be taken seriously by enough of them that her work survived and is still read and still performed today. We have stood at the oven in the dark, managed the fire with the calibrated knowledge of years, watched the loaves, and carried the weight of the regulations on our backs with the practical resignation of someone who has done the calculation and knows where the margin is. And we have sat at the feast and looked down the length of the hall and understood, in the way that only the full view of the room can make you understand, that the food is never just the food. It is always also the story of who gets it, who made it, and what it costs to be on the wrong side of that distinction. The fire is low tonight, the oven is cooling, the pot from this morning is empty and has been set aside for tomorrow, and the bread is gone and the ale is finished, and there is nothing left to do now but rest, and rest is enough. You have spent a long time today thinking about food as a system, about the gap between the image and the reality, about the bodies that worked and the bodies that feasted and the bodies in between. You can put that down now. The medieval world will still be there tomorrow, still complicated, still uneven, still producing its grey pottage and its golden subtleties with the same imperturbable consistency that history always brings to the task of being itself. For now, the day is done. The sounds are quieter. Whatever you are carrying from today, you can set it aside. The straw mattress and the cold room and the pottage and the oven and the feast, let them drift. You were there, and now you're here, and here is considerably more comfortable, and that is worth something. That is worth quite a lot, actually, when you have spent the evening somewhere that reminds you how recently the margin was much thinner. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.